To understand securitization and the securitization dilemma, it helps to think about chairs, and cats, and urinals, and art, and maybe not always in that order. How we perceive and talk about things matters, because how we perceive and talk about things is how we construct reality. This is one of those insights so simultaneously obvious and perplexing that philosophers have been grappling with it for generations. We're going to need to get a little heady and weird for a few minutes here, so get ready. Okay, one of these things is a chair, and one of these things is a cat. Can you tell which is which? Well, sure, of course you can. Now, one of these things is a Bedfordshire-style urinal. The other one is a priceless piece of art, considered by art historians to be among the dozen or so most influential works of the 20th century. Can you tell which is which? Okay, the signature was probably a giveaway. And as an aside, what's funny is that that's not even the signature of the artist. That thing on the right is Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain. Duchamp created the thing by walking into a New York hardware store, buying the standard Bedfordshire urinal, taking it back to his studio, signing it, and placing it at an unconventional angle. The piece was received horribly on arrival by critics, who said, "It may be very useful as an object in its place, but its place is not at an art exhibition, and it is by no definition a work of art." I'm guessing that today the curators of the Pompidou Center in Paris, the San Francisco Art Museum, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art would differ with that assessment, because they have replicas, not even the real thing, but replicas, which are major pieces in their collections. To understand securitization, we need to understand how this little expedition into modern art and philosophy relates to intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is the overlap in how people experience the world that allows them to develop shared senses of meaning. Around some things, like a cat or a chair, the overlap is pretty wide. Find me the most diehard political conservative and the most tree-hugging liberal, and they'll both agree that the cat is a cat. But art experts of Duchamp's time did not even recognize his artwork as art. There was no overlap between his concept of art and theirs. Sure, Duchamp knew what they thought constituted art. He was aware of what art critics thought at the time, but the reason his piece has ultimately been so influential is that it successfully transformed a concept, art, that we seemingly all thought we understood, and in doing so, it created a new reality. Okay, well, what's that got to do with climate security? The concept of threat is not like a cat or a chair. It's more like modern art. It really depends on an observer's perspective. That is, threat is in the eye of the beholder. Some would go so far as to say that the concept of threat is entirely subjective, and that the process of labeling something as a threat is inherently political. This process is known as securitization. Securitization is the process of transforming subjects or things, be they actors or natural phenomenon, into threats, or matters of security that legitimize extraordinary means to be used in the name of security. Now, what are extraordinary means? If you've heard the term by any means necessary, you might associate it with Malcolm X. Actually, the term was coined by Franz Fanon to refer to the moral right to use violence to end oppression of the black race, at a time when the common belief was that nonviolence was the only acceptable means of pursuing liberation. That is, the dire nature of the threat of oppression and structural violence legitimated the use of violence in kind. It put it on the table in circumstances where it might otherwise have seemed unacceptable. Practically, securitization tends to have three effects. First, it allows for militarized response strategies to threats that may be non-obviously militarized in nature. Second, it allows mobilization of resources and sacrifices that otherwise would not be possible. And third, it renders discussion and dissent around these threats out of bounds. Dissent can be legitimately silenced in the face of a significant threat. The first is the militarization of response strategies. Think about a concept like the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive.
Now, it's non-obvious that drug use is a threat to U.S. national security. Many countries treat it as a public health issue or a mental health issue, and they do not try to address it through militarized means. The United States took a very different approach. In 1971, then-President Richard Nixon declared war on drugs, naming drugs public enemy number one. And keep in mind, this is in the midst of the actual Vietnam War, which would ultimately claim over 57,000 U.S. lives and millions of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Lao lives. Nixon declared war on drugs precisely because it would allow his administration to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. This isn't hearsay. This is straight from the mouth of John Ehrlichman, Nixon's counsel and advisor for domestic affairs. I'm quoting here. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or illegal to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Sounds like a hell of a guy, right? Now make no mistake, Nixon was anti-drug, and legitimately thought it was a threat to the nation. But going the militarized route allowed him to respond in ways that a public health-based response, for instance, never could have. A second effect of securitizing an issue or actor is mobilizing resources that would otherwise not be available. Prior to World War II, the U.S. federal government was a pretty small operation, with its total revenues and therefore resources amounting to an average of about 5% of GDP from 1929 to 1941. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, that changed. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. federal government claimed an average of 15% of GDP to fund the war effort, and it's stayed at that level pretty much ever since. This is even more obvious with something like the military draft. Most of the time, it's frowned upon to force people to work against their will on penalty of imprisonment. But that's what the draft is and how it operates. Wartime legitimated the practice of effectively forcing people to fight and sometimes die, often for causes they did not believe in.
Tell me, champ, would you have been prepared to go into the army if it hadn't been for the Vietnam War?
No, under no conditions do we take part in wars to take lives of other humans.
Heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali was sentenced to 5 years in prison for draft evasion. He lost his boxing title and was fined $10,000 for not wanting to fight in the Vietnam War. His prison conviction was ultimately overturned, but the whole experience cost him dearly. It cost him his public image, at least among a certain demographic, and 4 years of his fighting career during his prime. The third effect of securitization is the silencing of dissent. Once something becomes labeled as a threat, or a matter of national security, it legitimates all sorts of restrictions we otherwise would find abhorrent in a free society. This is actually where the concept of a clear and present danger, which we discussed last week, comes from. The phrase was coined by Oliver Wendell Holmes in the Supreme Court's unanimous decision, Schenck versus the United States, in 1919. That decision upheld a lower court's ruling that distributing anti-war, pro-socialist pamphlets was not protected speech and amounted to a criminal act, because it could undermine the war effort and thereby constitute a clear and present danger to U.S. national interests. The same rationale was used to imprison Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II for fear that they would sympathize with Imperial Japan and sabotage the U.S. war effort. One of these camps was right here in eastern Colorado in the town of Grenada. It's also normally frowned upon to spit on 13-year-old children, but evidently my preteen opposition to the first Gulf War was enough to legitimate my getting spit on by someone who found me too unpatriotic. Now, for these reasons, one can see why securitizing climate change might be attractive from a climate action perspective, even if you're not all that convinced of the actual clear and present danger it presents. It would seemingly allow us to move past the political wrangling about climate change and get down to business. It would move the topic out of ordinary political discussions and make it into an existential crisis needing attention. It would mobilize resources and encourage people to sacrifice in pursuit of the greater good. And it would turn climate denial from a political stance to treasonous. But there are reasons why this might not be a very good idea. Securitizing climate change might wind up funneling more resources into agencies and organizations that are not, in the main, the ones that are most useful in addressing the issues. Well, yes, Senator, I know we asked for $100 billion more in defense spending than last year, but the Air Force needs all these new weather observation planes to track climate change. Now, wouldn't that money make more sense to invest in addressing forest fires or natural disaster response or better understanding climate science? Are those missions and that expertise the specialty of the mounted cavalry? Probably not. The mounted cavalry? Probably not. Another reason is that it may backfire. Part of the reason the war on drugs was a failure in terms of fighting drug use is because the rhetoric was simply not backed up by many people's experience. This is a trailer for the infamous Reefer Madness, an anti-drug propaganda film released in the 1930s.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
Now, this is probably not going to shock many, or even any of you, but there are not a whole lot of cases of marijuana-induced psychosis to be found in medical records. I'm guessing the idea of marijuana being dangerous to many of you is pretty nonsensical, especially relative to other options out there. Who would you rather find yourself sitting next to at a football game? A stranger who just drunk an entire case of beer, or someone who is blazed out of their mind? It's why the long-term marijuana prohibition effort was never going to work. People could see through the hype. It just didn't make any sense. Now, I'm not saying climate change is overhyped. I'd be a very odd person to be making that claim. But I am saying that because of the slow onset, multi-channel nature of the way it presents as a threat, there's a danger that securitization will backfire because it does not seem directly threatening. And this could ultimately lead legitimate security concerns around climate change to be ignored. If you get a reputation for crying wolf when the threat is actually a puppy, your audience might not believe you when the wolf actually arrives at the door. This is the crux of the securitization dilemma. The more it is done, not just with climate change, but with a host of other issues facing the policy community, it dilutes the concept of security and threat and renders people incapable of correctly prioritizing threats. Now, my take on securitization and climate discourse is pretty simple. Securitization is not inherently the same thing as militarization, especially if you accept the premise that both human and national security matter a great deal. Now, there will be national security threats emanating from climate change, and, in fact, from attempts to combat it. But the real threats to security will be, first and foremost, to human security.